Kia ora koutou. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am really stoked to have Abigail Cunninghame join me, Celia Hogan, on this kōrero tonight. I just thought I'll open up with a karakia and then kind of introduce the evening. So, whakatakatahau ki te uru, whakatakatahau ki te tonga, kia makinakina, ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, hi aki ana te ata kura, hi tio, hi huka, hi hohu, te hei mauri ora. So thank you everyone for coming along. It is fantastic to see you here tonight. Can we just get everyone to please mute themselves? That would be fantastic. I can actually even do that in the little side thing by the looks of it, which is really good. So I'm just muting a few people who aren't quite muted yet. Fantastic. So we are here tonight. We are talking about the wonderful topic of embracing biodiversity in your schoolyard. The great thing is that I know there are some early childhood teachers as well as primary teachers and other educators or nature enthusiasts from all over Aotearoa. So welcome everyone. It is great to have you here. For those who don't know me, my name is Celia Hogan. I run a business called Little Kiwis Nature Play, and we're big advocates for getting kids outdoors and into nature and playing in the way that they're designed to play in a natural child-led kind of way. And what really connected me to Abigail was just seeing her thesis. Somehow it ended up in my inbox. Someone else had tagged me into what she was doing, and I was like, wow, this is exactly the kind of environment that we're looking for when we are talking about play. So I thought this is a great thing to be sharing with people. So that's how we connected. I'm going to hand over to Abigail now just to introduce herself, and then we will kick off with the evening. So over to you, Abigail.
Cool. Kia ora, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining Celia and myself tonight. I hope we've all got a cup of tea or something a bit yummier in a teacup next to us. Yeah, a little bit about myself. I've had quite a varied education, I guess. I began with a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Otago, then went on to a Bachelor of Applied Science at the Unitec Institute of Technology up in Auckland. Followed on from that with a postgraduate diploma in biosecurity and conservation at the University of Auckland. So I've just unmuted myself again. And then followed on with a Master of Science at the University of Auckland again in the biosecurity and conservation realm. So I've been pretty busy. I've always been a big, plant, animal, environment person, as I think a lot of Kiwis are. And I just really felt pulled, I've always felt pulled to joining communities and people with science and getting them more involved in nature. And that's kind of where I got to the point where I sent Margaret an email just before we went into lockdown in 2020 and wanted to work with her about how to join communities with nature, and specifically children. I mean, we've all heard that saying that, the kids are the future, and to make any real change in this world, we've got to get the younger generations involved. And that's what got me here to my thesis and then to Celia. So yeah, thank you all for coming tonight.
Fantastic. I always love hearing people's journeys of how they arrive and where they are. And I think you're right. Lots of Kiwis kind of do have a really strong connection to nature, whether they know it or not. So, right. I think before we kick into the thesis part, I just want to ask you one question. And I'm going to use the word primary schools for this, but I'm kind of generally meaning any education space or setting. But could primary schools be the solution for improving biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. So there hasn't been much research done globally actually about green spaces and biodiversity in schools, but what has been done in the UK showed that primary schools were kind of that age range to hit. For one, there's lots of them. I mean, in New Zealand, we have just over, I believe it is 2,200 primary schools across the country. So that's urban, rural, public, and private primary schools. So it's a massive group of property that we have available that's already there. It's not like we're trying to add, more spaces. Schools are already there. They're already established. We're always going to need them. So let's, make the most of them. And yes, that the primary school age range, and actually I think it cuts a little bit into ECE age range, is where a lot of key relationships are formed as young children. And so we really want to make sure that we're, forming healthy and positive relationships with the natural world around us at a young age, rather than trying to course correct these later on in, secondary school or adulthood.
Absolutely.
So I think it's maximizing, shifting towards multifunctional spaces. So schools can be both education facilities, but also biodiverse ground.
Absolutely. And I think, we've got another one coming in. And I think sometimes people will talk to me about saying that they connected with nature when they were younger, and then kind of when they went through some of their schooling, they kind of separated away from it but came back to it. So I think it is really important to have these opportunities when they're young. So let's dive into it. Your thesis was really interesting. I loved reading it, and you had an infographic that you put together, and that was really cool. And we could even put that up in the Facebook event afterwards. I don't know if that's in there. But do you just want to kick us off and talk about what your thesis involved, what the findings were? And again, I know it's from about primary schools, but there's lots that you can apply to any education setting here. So yeah.
So I'll say primary schools a lot, but what I say can be put into ECE and secondary school context as well. But
fantastic.
For the sake of this thesis, I'll just say primary school. Okay, so I will share my screen. Can everyone see that one?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'll start us off just by saying or acknowledging the people in the groups that helped me get to where I am. Obviously, a really big thank you to my incredible supervisor, Margaret Stanley, who is also here tonight. So the title of my thesis was The Ecological Condition and the Use of Green Spaces in Primary Schools. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's okay. So to summarize, here we go. These are the numbers, I guess, the very quick snapshot. I did my thesis part-time because, as I said previously, I've spent too many years at university, so I decided to make it part-time to make it a little bit easier. But it worked out for the good, actually. So 26 months. I went to 64 primary schools in Auckland. I had 118 teachers complete an online questionnaire. And I won't go through all the numbers there, but the rest is there. My thesis can be split really nicely, actually, into two core sections. So I have the physical ecological side. So that involved going to the 64 primary schools across Auckland, and also the social side. So that was getting the teachers to respond to a questionnaire and learning a bit more about how they perceive the green spaces on their school grounds, but also how they use them. I'm a really big believer that science isn't just for scientists, and ecology especially is a very social science area. So having that social element was really important. So those are the numbers to summarize it. I could be really boring and go through all of the figures that I had to put in my thesis, but no one would enjoy it, and they're really ugly because I had to make them all funny colors. So really, we'll just talk about the schools. So how do we get from, the relatively concrete jungle that we have on the left to the really stunning biodiverse school that I went to on the right-hand side? And this is what it was really about for me. I wanted to see what the differences were in social factors, socioeconomic factors, all the ecological factors that separated schools that might have looked like those on the left that were seemingly not very biodiverse to those on the right that, were like a little forest in this very urban primary school. So I was looking at the relationships and kind of just getting a bit of a start point to see what we have really, and how we can move on from there and kind of get the light shining on primary schools as these, big potential areas. And what I found was that there is a massive potential for the enhancement of biodiversity in schools. Physically, I think, and Kiwis do this well again, that we need to think outside the box about how to use our space better. I'll go into it a little bit later, but most schools have the grass, the ground level cover and tall trees, presumably for shade cover, but we're missing the vertical layers. So even with smaller schools, you can add more into those layers just by looking at what we've already got. There's a really big need for more awareness and knowledge around weed identification and management. Again, I'll go into that a little bit more later on, but there were, especially in Auckland, because that's where I went to these schools, but I'm imagining across the country, far too many weed species on schools that we really need to try and cut down on. Socially, which was quite positive, a lot of the teachers actually recognise the importance of nature and the green space they have on their schools, and almost all of the teachers that completed my questionnaire noted that there are positive behavioural changes in the students after they engage in these green spaces. So that's really positive. But the big limitations to both the use of these green spaces but also improving them were funding, time and governorship. So there's these big barriers that we need to help schools overcome to make primary schools and schools in general as kind of green as they can be.
And those three areas, funding, time and governance, I'm definitely sure there will be people in here who are, going, yep. And if that's you, maybe put that in the chat room, do any of those resonate with you? Or is there something else that's a little bit of the barrier, one of those barriers? Before we talk about the barriers a little bit more, I was going to ask you about the attitudes and motivations of teachers and, when they're considering environmental education or their kind of biodiversity in the outdoor space. So, how do teachers perceive their green spaces in schools?
So for this one, getting the attitudes of teachers and kind of understanding how they perceive the spaces, I actually chose to collect data by a word association. So I basically asked teachers, the 5 words that come to mind when they think of their green spaces. And a lot of them were really positive. We had nature and sustainable and learning in there. So, there's a positive association with green spaces. I was aware that there was probably a bit of a bias, that the teachers that completed my survey were likely those that were already leaning towards being more nature friendly. But there were still some in there that, we had untidy, we had messy. So there were still ones in there that maybe people aren't as kind towards the green spaces on their primary schools. But overall, it was really, really positive. And this actually flowed a little bit nicely onto it. I'll go to the next slide. What the teachers thought were the biggest benefits of the green space on their schoolyards. So for this one, they had a list that they could choose from. Facilitating a physical interaction between the natural world and children was the most commonly selected benefit. So that's really cool. So the teachers are acknowledging that it's really important that their students engage and connect with the nature around them. But contribution to biodiversity was the least selected. So there's a gap there that, the teachers aren't, or our teachers aren't seeing that next step that the green spaces can have on their school grounds. They're seeing the initial, we can get our kids out there, but we're missing that next step type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. So where do teachers encourage their children to play then?
Yeah, so this flowed actually really nicely onto, I made the graph prettier for everyone for the slideshow. So what this is showing actually is the question was, where do teachers encourage the students to play? But this is during break times. This isn't during class time. This was morning tea or lunchtime, or before school care or after school care. And every teacher selected a sports field, which, yeah, okay. But very, very little selected the more niche green spaces that we've got down the bottom. So we've got fruit trees, worm farm, mud kitchen. So all those more interactive and more biodiverse green spaces that schools might have, the students aren't actually being encouraged to kind of play in them and connect with them as much as they are a sports field, which is not very biodiverse at all. Is really what this shows.
And I wonder, like, you may have come across this, but does it depend on how biodiverse the school outdoor space is? For example, if it's quite diverse, maybe this data changes a little bit. Like if there's less sport field focus and more kind of biodiversity focus, I wonder if this changes.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite a big factor. And if the spaces aren't available on schools to begin with, the students can't be encouraged to play in them anyway. And every school, most schools actually have a sports field. So
yeah.
And potentially, because we saw in that last slide, biodiversity isn't being recognised as a main benefit of green space. So that this might also be why the students aren't then being encouraged to engage with these spaces, because there's a potential that teachers might view the green space on a school ground as all equal, and so playing the sports field is like as connecting to nature, sorry, as a worm farm, when we know that a worm farm is, or a bee garden or shrubbery is more biodiverse than a sports field.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess this kind of nicely ties into those barriers. So what are teachers seeing as the barriers? Like, I'm kind of imagining some of the schools I work with, and there's these large open grass fields and a couple of trees dotted around the outside. So yeah, let us know what some of those barriers
are. So I anticipated that health and safety would be quite a major barrier, just because of the world we live in. I know that there's at primary schools, or at least for me and the chats I've had with caretakers and teachers, that there are out of bounds areas on a lot of schools, because teachers lose that line of vision, and I imagine it's even more so in early childhood education centres. But surprisingly, health and safety was the fifth highest barrier that teachers selected. The cost of installation and the cost of maintenance were the two much more selected barriers selected. So that was quite revealing, and definitely shows that we need to help out our schools and our teachers a little bit more, especially I mean, it was nice to see that health and safety was lower, but I don't disregard that there are health and safety risks to having potentially a more biodiverse bush area. But that's definitely some barriers that we need to work to overcome.
I think as well, when something's within a school space, like, or a kindergarten or a ECE, you've got the fenced area, and that feels kind of safe. But I think from a health and safety perspective, when people go beyond the gates, that perception kind of rises a lot there. But it still is interesting there.
It was definitely interesting.
We've got a couple of things coming through, just some general comments, just some interesting things. Have a read if you haven't looked in there already. One person saying lack of funding is a major barrier. Someone else was involved in a weed outreach. Colin was talking about early last century, all schools should feature New Zealand native plants in their school grounds. So I totally agree with that. There's a weed hunt tool. And then we've got a question: was there a rural versus urban divide in schools with the greatest diversity? Did you measure that at all?
Good question. So I chose to only focus on urban primary schools for this research. Given the spatial restrictions with an urban school, rural schools were undoubtedly going to have maybe not more biodiversity, but definitely larger green spaces. That just sort of skewed my data collect a little bit, but that was part of my my future research recommendation, that we bring in those rural schools, because there's a large rural community within Aotearoa that I think needs to be included in future studies in this area. So no, I didn't look at that, but I think it would be very interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. So just, there's one more question in the chat from Thea. Did Kayako worry about kids damaging the flora and fauna? So from her experience, this has always been a bit of a tension within schools. And I don't think it's just in schools, it can also be with park rangers as well, like in botanic gardens or other places where there's planted species. Question over to you. Yeah,
there's definitely some controversy around this. I think I didn't find any of it in my space, but when you do some research, that is a main, I guess, issue with people put money and time into making these really beautiful gardens, and then the risk that kids might trample it or get involved can damage it. But studies actually show that the damage isn't actually, if you plan it properly, planting lots of little seedlings all in one area, likely they're going to get damaged. But with proper planning and the right species in a school, you can actually avoid a lot of the damage. And it's really important, the sensory impact, or the sensory kind of connection that children can have, not just by visually viewing green spaces and gardens in their schools, but actually getting into it and touching and smelling and seeing different elements of all the green spaces there outweighs the I guess the adult version of damage that we might see. But yes, it is something that I think an issue that could limit some schools and parks and everything from adding a little bit more to their green spaces.
Absolutely. One, I was just thinking also back to, I run another conference called the Nature Play Conference, and in the very first year we were talking about how kids sometimes climb trees or they might break a branch, etc., and like that's just part of them learning. And then a lovely park ranger who's a friend stood up and goes, well, no, that's not okay. And we had this quite robust conversation about what is okay. And I think what we came out with, and from talking to Kaimātua about this point, was that sometimes for something to be broken or damaged early on in a child's life can be forgiven, because in the future they will be the guardians of the whole forest, and they will protect the whole forest, and it's a teaching opportunity. So if a child does accidentally break a branch, we can teach there rather than kind of be punitive about that. So and then when we teach, then the respect grows and the learning happens as well. I think it's there's a lot of pros and cons, but I think it's and it's, as you say, the planning is really important. So if you're going to go to the part of the school where there's a lot of foot traffic and you're going to plant lots of seedlings, well, you have to manage that in a way that's going to be protect that space until it's large enough to be able to sustain itself. Right. Can we just make sure everyone's muted, please?
Actually, Barbie.
Oh,
it's mine.
Lisa. Hello, how are you? Hey, right. So there's a couple of other comments in the chat room. Colin makes a good point, which I know you're on board with. Abigail was just talking about the distinction between biodiversity, thinking at it from the unique contribution to global biodiversity versus, species richness. So have we read of that point there? and talking about ecological literacy at a time when the world desperately needs better understanding.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So great comments coming in there. Fantastic. Okay, well, do you have any further points, Abigail, before or anything that you know is going through your mind that you want to talk about from your thesis before we get into some of the tips around how to help create some more biodiversity into your school or outdoor spaces? You think you've covered everything you planned?
I've covered. I can talk about this for a while, but I'll open it. Does anyone else have any other questions before we keep moving? Otherwise, I'll take up too much time.
Well, let's start into the tips then, because I know you have 3 kind of main areas that you want to talk about that can help schools and centres bring in or develop more biodiversity in their spaces. So do you want to kick us off with the first tip?
Yeah. So tip 1, and these the 3 tips that I had on the infographic as well. So the first one was diversity of spaces. So the 2 top spaces that schools had were a sports field and a flower bed. So two spaces. And like I said earlier, we can add vegetation layers. So every school's got grass and tall trees, but we can add in those vegetation layers so that even spatially small schools can still mix up their green areas. So like that photo on the right, you've just got, there's not even grass in that one. You've got a tall tree, nothing underneath it. Whereas we can make green spaces look a little bit more like this. We've got, leaf litter ground cover, we've got tall canopy, emerging trees, but then we've got some shrub layers in there as well. They're young, they've planted them, but they'll come up. So they've got, in one area, a much more diverse green space. And another way to think about that is actually adding plantings around a sports field. I don't negate the importance of having a sports field in schools. Kids need to move, and sports fields allows them to do that. But that area around the perimeter of a sports field is kind of up for grabs. We can plant shrubs, we can plant trees. Those trees and shrubbery will provide shade that New Zealand desperately needs come summertime. It's an easy way for schools to bulk up their diversity and the plantings that they've got. Inclusion of kai gardens, so veggie gardens, orchards, things that we can get children involved in early as well. You can have some like homemade lunches at home if that's the case. It's a nice easy thing to get kids involved. They can also bring what they learn at school home then, so we can try to get some more people kind of having their own veggie gardens at home and making the most of the spaces they've got. And so adding the vegetation layers and diversity of spaces will bring in more birds and bugs and insects and all things like that makes up biodiversity within schools. So that's point 1. If there's no questions, I'll move on to point 2. Yes, insect-friendly gardens, as Tash said. So there were some really cool cases of a lizard lounge or a bug hotel. So there's these spaces that take up not much room at all, but ecologically add massive value. And it's really cool. The kids can get involved, or wetter houses, so they can have little peepholes so the kids can actually see the wetters. And I think it's a really easy. Those are some easy ways that you can improve school grounds. The next one is to remove our major weeds, and I touched on this earlier. So in Auckland, the schools I went to were in Auckland. Woolly nightshade was at 20 of 64 schools. Now the schools I went to were a range of, deciles and equity index values. So I went to a socioeconomic mix of schools to keep it, really even and get information on everything I could. So to have 20 out of 64, and they weren't at the lower decile schools or the higher decile, it was a real even spread. So that's a massive one. Japanese honeysuckle moth plant in, you know, in Christchurch, there is, I think Celia was saying, I've lost my sheet, there's hemlock, there's some ivy, there's at every school in every region, maybe not every school, but at schools in every region, there I would almost guarantee there'd be major weeds. So that brings in, you know, making schools and teachers more aware of what weeds they might have in the area. So DOC's got amazing lists, Manaki Whenua has amazing lists, local governments, you know, Christchurch City Council, Dunedin City Council, likely have their own weed species lists that can be checked. But it's definitely, I don't want to say it's an easy step, but sometimes psychologically removing something seems like an easier task than adding something. So
yeah,
and it's I mean, these weeds are dangerous, they're noxious or poisonous, and especially when kids are involved, and a big part of learning is touching everything. You know, I used to eat Japanese honeysuckle at school, so you know, kids eat everything. Yeah, weed busters, Jenny just put on the chat. It's being really aware of what's on school grounds and removing these weeds whenever we can, and also getting the news out to the communities and to the families of these schools to make sure that it's not, you know, removing it on one school ground. We still want the neighbours nearby to remove the same weed species, otherwise it's a really vicious circle. So.
And now I'm sure there will be some people kind of going, what do these things look like? And you know, like that is one of the biggest challenges, that we don't know what we don't know. And I've definitely been caught in that myself, where I was like, oh, what's this? And it's like, oh, that's actually quite poisonous. But I didn't know. So there are a few great apps that you can use for plant identification. I know Colin would like me to say this. iNaturalist is a great app. You can take a photo of it, of any flora or fauna. And so you take
$63.18.
Pardon, sorry? Hello? Did someone just comment? I'm going to mute that person. I love this. I love muting. So iNaturalist, great. You can take photos and you can kind of try and see what the app thinks it might be, but also there are, you know, thousands of people who will, you know, be able to comment on that for you and give you some correct identification. The other thing, I think, did you mention it, or like Landcare Research has some great lists of all poisonous kind of plants or weed species, and there's one specifically there for early childhood education. One thing I do want to say is that sometimes people get scared about, you know, going into these outdoor spaces because of the weeds, or like because of poisonous plants. You know, do you have any thoughts on that? Because, you know, not all poisonous plants are equal, in that some are deadly and others might give you a wee upset tummy, but only if you ate your body weight of that plant. Can you talk to that just briefly, Abigail?
I think, I mean, each school would be different and each region would be different. I think it's just, it's becoming aware of what is really weedy and nasty in your area and going from there. And also, not all non-natives or exotic species are weeds. I think some people get a little bit muddled that if it's not a native, it must be a weed, which isn't the case. I mean, there's plenty of non-native trees, you know, lots of oak trees at primary schools in Auckland. Please don't cut them down because they're very large and they provide lots of shade. but yeah, I think it's just that knowledge gap. Just recognizing what's really dangerous, why it's dangerous, and how to get rid of it and keep it out. You know,
and what
weed management
the
is part of
children can be engaged with to remove, and what ones they can't. You know, like if it is actually seriously poisonous, maybe that might not be one that the children are involved in. Whereas, you know, there might be some other weeds which the children can remove in a safe way.
Yeah, and I think, and Kate's actually mentioned it or commented it, and there's really cool incentivization programs. So in the Howick local board, there's a moth plant competition. So that gets the kids and the families all really excited and competitive about removing as many, you know, moth plant pods that they can.
Yeah.
So that's one that they, you know, there's that education around how to remove it and how to make sure you get all the my brain.
Yeah,
I've forgotten the last part now.
that's all right.
But yeah, so there's programs
Yeah.
around that get them involved. But I think it's region specific and understanding what you've got and going from there.
Absolutely. And I like Murray's comment that ivy is massively overlooked. I agree, especially down here in Christchurch. I just see it all over the place. And yeah. Cool. So we've gone through your first two kind of tips there. Should we move on to tip number 3?
Yeah. So tip 3 is to prioritize and diversify native plantings. In Auckland, the schools I went to, there were lots of native plants and trees, but they were massively dominated by 2 species, which was putakawa and cabbage trees, which I don't think will come to any surprises, Aucklanders or anyone here actually. So any plantings that do happen within schools, I think, to prioritize them to be native species. New Zealand's a biodiversity hotspot, so we should really be trying to protect and also promote our native species as much as we can. It also stimulates a really good relationship with our native birds, our native insects. It gets the whole kind of circle of life happening for our species here. So prioritizing the native seedlings, but also, diversifying. So we don't want to just have putakawa. So any Aucklanders here, please, no one plant any more putakawa. There was so many, and I love them, but we don't need any more. There's a risk of having a monoculture, which then is susceptible to, myrtle rust in the case of putakawa. That will devastate, biodiversity there. So mixing things up a bit. I mean, you've got puriri, you've got karaka, rewa, titoki. You've got all these other quite stunning and can provide decent shade native trees to plant instead of putakawa, but definitely to prioritize. And there's programs that get kids involved, and you can get seedlings to schools to get relatively cheap or free, I think, in some cases. So that's the big one, is to we want to plant more on schools, and I've said how to diversify your spaces and planting the different layers, but where possible to plant our natives. It's how kids are going to learn about what we've got here. It's how we're going to promote native urban biodiversity. It's go native.
Yeah, and there are a couple of questions in here around, what about poisonous natives, etc. And, like for me, I think it's okay to have poisonous natives, or even, poisonous plants. For example, some people might not agree with me here, but even just monarch butterflies, like the swan plants, they're highly poisonous, but there's some really great educational elements for children that might not fit with all people on here tonight. I'm not sure how people feel about swan plants, but like they're a really interesting plant for children to explore and engage with. So Felicity is asking, what about poisonous natives? What are your thoughts, Abigail?
Oh, I mean, there's that fine line. I mean, health and safety is big, but I mean, I think Murray's here karaka is native with poisonous fruit. Yes, if the kids eat the fruit. So if you can plant karaka with the knowledge and teach, the students and the children about why it's poisonous and why not to eat it, you're teaching them while also still having a native plant. And if that's the case, I mean, some schools had kowhai on their school grounds, I found, and again, kowhai is a poisonous one if you eat it. It's that knowledge, just making sure that everyone's aware. I mean, you've got to eat quite a bit of it as well. I think it's region specific. Again,
teachers
everyone's
need
teachable.
to know. So teachers need to know, or schools need to know, so they can inform their teachers.
Exactly.
So
and
that
Sarah's
would
actually
be,
put
a board responsibility from a
Yeah.
health and safety perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah's put a lovely, poisonous plants are in nature, so a great teachable moment if present in schools. So perfect. She said it much better than I did.
Yeah, even at our bush kindy, like we have a number of poisonous plants, and it's all about education, and it goes well.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah, those are my three. I mean, there's lots of recommendations I can recommend to people, and if anyone has specific questions, they can contact me after. But those are the three, nice and clear. That I had them on the infographic. A good step one for schools wanting to increase their biodiversity on their grounds.
Now, I've got quite an interesting question from Tash in Nelson. She's asking, if you have no poisonous plants, how do you go about learning about them? And I think that's a really interesting one, and that goes back to that thing of what you don't know, you don't know. So if you don't have any on your educational space and you don't have anyone there to guide you, like, are there programs around that people can connect into, or educational things online?
Oh, I haven't found any, but I imagine that there would be, and there's lots of different conservation groups and learning areas, but I haven't.
Okay, maybe if there's anyone who's listening in who can help answer Tash's question, that would be really cool. Like for me, I buy a lot of books, and I have like poisonous plant books. The thing is, you've got indigenous or native plants, and then you've got tropical plants, and so it's a combination of both the knowledge and the different weeds that are poisonous. Sometimes some local space, I know here in Christchurch, there are weed walks, like little workshops, which are weed walks, and so people take you around on a walk, understanding the natural properties of those weeds. Some there's, when you look at native plants and weed plants, there's often a lot of those really positive elements that you can get from both, although weeds are weeds, but there are some really good medicinal ways that you can use those as well. So it's just going on a weed walk, even if you have a local community planting, if you go there, you'll no doubt find some weeds and find some knowledgeable people who would be happy to help identify, I'm sure. Someone's just said connect with your local community nursery. Weed walk, great idea, cool, awesome, and a couple of other ideas in there as well.
Dr. Park is a really good one. Okay, just put in.
Cool, Dr. Park, awesome. Nice. Okay, so we've gone through your kind of top tips. Now, one thing we were talking about before this was so sometimes we have maintenance people or groundskeepers who like to keep things kind of tidy, and that might not fit within a biodiversity type perspective. And they want to clean everything up, clear it all. So can you just talk to us a little bit about mess and the importance of, we're not talking about like complete shambles here, but what does it mean to be a bit messy from a biodiversity perspective?
So another of my recommendations in my thesis was living with Missy. So I think lawn mowing is a really good example here. We've assigned the idea of, well-maintained, aesthetically pleasing spaces to short grass, well-manicured trees, kind of visually appealing spaces, but this doesn't necessarily translate into high biodiverse areas. And especially when I was doing my data collection, I was, talking to a few caretakers and teachers, and there was definitely a disconnect between, what makes a school green and biodiverse and what is deemed messy or untidy. And, there was quite a few caretakers that would rather cut down all the trees because it means that they didn't have to rake up the leaves. Whereas, leaf litter is incredibly biodiverse, and I think all kids enjoy having a bit of a rumble in the leaf litter and playing around, but there's not any leaf litter for them to play in, and it was more seen as a hindrance to our caretakers than than the opportunity that they can be. So I think, yeah, I mean, you might know a bit more about this than I do, Celia, but definitely the concept of living with Missy and being more understanding that Missy doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, and actually if we kind of just embrace it, it's actually, it can be a really, really cool environment and heaps to learn, sensory heaven, you know, and just changing our perspective around what is, you know, aesthetically pleasing
Absolutely.
would be great. It'd be hard to implement, but it would be really, really cool.
Colin's put in here urban wild, which I like that terminology.
Yeah.
And just from a play perspective, you know, when we're talking about mess, we're essentially talking about loose parts. So children, one of the ways that they kind of explore in a play environment is they collect and use a lot of the elements that are loose parts, which are things that can be used in multiple different ways. So like a stick, leaves, you know, they can be multiple different things. A stick becomes a wand, it can be a stirrer, it can become drawing in the ground, it can become the side of a hut or a fairy shelter, or it can be a bow and arrow. It can be many different things. And so when we take those out of our play environments or natural environments, not only are we impacting on the biodiversity, but we're also impacting on how children play in those spaces. So like it's really important. And even from an early childhood perspective, when parents are asking, oh, where should I send my child, I say go to the messiest one that you can find. If it looks really clean and tidy, then they've got the wrong focus. You know, that's not for the children, that's for adults. So it's also really beneficial for children, which is great. Cool. I'll just check, we've got one last comment in there. And someone saying, unfortunately, it takes about 4 to 5. Oh, Rachel, hi, good kids screening Taupō. 4 to 5 years before our plantings look tidy, and it can be hard to convince people that trees will beat the grass, weeds looking good. Totally. And I lost a whole school restoration planting to a caretaker's weed eater this year. Oh, that is very, very demoralizing. Yes, I feel your pain, and that isn't, you know, that isn't what we want, is it? And so you know, when I'm doing any of my PD with around play, and I think it would be around biodiversity as well, that it's not just for the teachers, it's actually for the admin staff, the groundskeepers, the board of trustees. You actually need to have everyone understanding this and getting on the same page, because you know, everyone needs to understand what that's about and why and what that looks like. I know in my kids' school, there's conversations all the time between the caretaker and the outdoor classroom teacher about what's allowed to be there and what's not. And it's really important to have those conversations right at the start.
I think that's just highlighting the knowledge gap that people have. I mean, if, you know, a productive conversation with some caretakers about why it's so important to have these spaces, it could just, you know, they might just be really unaware. And like you said, you don't know what you don't know. So there's definitely room to improve here. And
Colin's saying, you know, the caretakers might need to learn a bit of that eco-literacy too, spray drift or ring barking and weed eaters, you know. Sometimes they don't go so well together. Hey, cool. So we were going to kind of finish off caretaker workshops. That's a good idea. You can run those, Jenny. What do you think? Yes, the session is being recorded and slides. I don't know if slides will be shared, but we can.
Absolutely. I can send that to you, Celia. I can put them somewhere. No worries.
What we just wanted to do was just a short sum up. Like I talked a little bit there about play, because, you know, like we are talking to teachers in schools, but just understanding why it's, you know, it's so important to have those biodiverse play spaces outdoors. But how, you know, what play looks like when you do have a biodiverse schoolyard. So we're talking about like having natural elements in your schoolyards, as well as a number of the tips that Abigail's given. So it could be things like logs, rocks, you know, tree stumps for children to climb and balance along, and just a bit of that imaginative play as well. we're looking at exploration type areas. So this could be some of the things that were talked about, you know, the nature trails or having bug hotels, that kind of thing. Sensory gardens, so where that's, you know, even flowers and things that children can pick, or herbs in the garden that they can eat, that kind of thing. Abigail talked about gardening. I think that's a really great way to get children engaged in biodiversity. So I won't talk any more about that. But the other element is, you know, I'm a big advocate for developing the outdoor classroom. And so what we can be talking about there is, there's two kind of elements to that. There can be a literal outdoor classroom where you're actually creating a seated area where you go and just take a lesson outside, or actually having the space that brings your curriculum alive. So instead of teaching your science class in the classroom, you're taking that out and you're doing it in your schoolyard. And for that, you know, you want to have biodiversity. As soon as we're outside in, you know, in our outdoor schoolyard or in nature, you know, STEM, when we're thinking about curriculum areas, science, technology, engineering, maths, it exists in so many different ways outdoors. So we just have to have that environment ready for that to play out. And we've also talked about sensory play experiences. So you know, sand, water play areas, mud pits, exploration. So I know that's not always, you know, in line with what you're talking about here, but it's just that part of having those experiences outdoors, and, you know, they're engaging with the wildlife or the birds that are singing in the trees. So they're connecting to nature and developing that relationship. So it's just general play outside. They're hearing everything and seeing everything that's going around. They're seeing the changes of the seasons. So it's really important to have a biodiverse environment so that they can have that. Just on there, I noticed I was overseas for quite a long time and came back. And when I went to Wellington, I remember coming out of the car and I felt really shocked by the sound of the birds. Like I had never heard Wellington quite like that. And it was just amazing. The sound, it was just so loud compared to what I ever remembered it when I was growing up. So yeah, children are really present in their play, and they will notice things. You know, they will notice the little bee that's flying around. They will notice the butterfly or the bird or the little worm on the ground. So we need to have those environments that can cater for our children in that way.
Definitely.
Cool. That was just a little sum up, just to kind of pull it in a little bit. Yeah, so are there any final questions from people in the chat? Natural loose parts available? Yes, absolutely. I'm a huge advocate for that. I think it's essential. And loose parts support all children's schema and also risky play. So without it, you're hindering the way children grow and develop. When there's enough loose parts available, children play in the way that they're designed to play, and they're able to kind of develop and grow really well. We often see a lot more arguments when there's not enough kind of natural loose parts around, because they get bored on the play equipment, the structures that are there. So loose parts enable them to be creative and extend themselves in the ways that they need to. Sarah's asking, have you linked in with local councils to supply plants for planting at schools?
No, I haven't. I have made recommendations for government and local government to kind of get a bit more involved, but this is just step one. This is just getting a master's out there, but that's definitely the next step. And Margaret and I are working on steps 2, 3 through 11. So
yeah,
stay tuned.
And there are a lot of councils who are doing some great work, and a lot of organisations. I know Trees for Canterbury here in Aotearoa, Christchurch, they do a lot of donating of trees to schools and local groups for planting. So it's out there. So schools can, connect in with some of those local ones. I think you named one in Auckland. Can you remember the name of that one?
I think that was Trees for Sustainability.
Trees for Sustainability.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So there is
Yeah, Rachel from Kids Greening Taupo is saying that they provide native plants to schools in the Taupo area. So they get funded by Contact Energy and through a local trail running event, which is awesome. And Chris Montgomery saying, thanks, very interesting research. Wellington City Council makes plants available to schools and community groups. So there are a number of places out there that do that. I think even connecting with your local nursery, if you said what it was for, that they might be able to be some kind of collaboration. They might donate them for you as well. Thea is put in trees for survival. Tash, wow, steps through to 11. That's awesome. Love your master's research. So great you're sharing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Tash. Awesome. So we hope that you have managed to get a few tips or even just inspiration. Like, I think a lot of us know some of this stuff, but just hearing those couple of ways, tips of how you can start, where you can start. And I think it's about just taking that step, isn't it? And going, right, let's just do this. Let's make the step. Let's do a bit of planting around our sports area. That will be, you know, our first step, or getting everyone on side. So yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. All the comments coming through. Another great tip from Rachel, this would be good, is collecting native seedlings from in pine forests. Cool. So that's another thing. And yeah, so connecting with local groups that do that kind of thing. A few thank yous. Brilliant. We have loved our time. I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm going to finish with a karakia and we'll finish the recording. So,
Cool.
Kia tau ngā manakitanga a te mea naro, ki runga ki tēnā o tātou, kia mahia te hua ma kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu, ka whakamoa, kia teina huie, tākie.